Yesterday, I put out a piece called Fed Sight, Far Sight, in which I looked at the summary of economic projections. And the summary of economic projections is done every quarter and is released after the Fed meeting, in this case, the Fed meeting of the 15th of March. The summary of economic projections doesn't just include the people who were voting, members of the Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve on the day. It also includes economic projections by all of the Fed presidents, whether they were voting or not. And the reason that happens is that when you actually see these Fed presidents talk, as I have over the years now, what you see is they're supported by quite large research teams, and neglecting the research team of, say, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco or the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, just because the president wasn't voting at the meeting, would lose a lot of really valuable research and outlook on the US economy. The Fed has upgraded its outlook for growth for the US economy since last December. Well, it has just a little bit. At the previous meeting, it thought the growth this year and next year would be 2%. This time around, it's upgraded that growth rate to a median estimate of 2.1% this year and 2.1% next year. And as far as the Fed is concerned, that's as good as it gets, because the result of Fed rate hikes, and I'll talk about them in a minute, reduce growth by the time you get to the end of 18. So growth declines to 1.9% in 19 and 1.8% the year after that. And the result of that is that this year you have unemployment declining from 4.7% to 4.5%, and it holds at 4.5% next year and the year after. In the long term, it drifts back up to about 4.7%. And as this process goes on, what we see is that inflation is rising, and the Fed measure of inflation, which is the core PCE deflator. Now, the core PCE deflator is used, not the core CPI. And what the core PCE deflator is, it's part of the national accounts way of measuring inflation. And in the national accounts way of measuring inflation, they adjust the weighting of what's being spent, of the money that's being spent each quarter, to adjust for changes in actual consumer activity as measured within the national accounts. So changes from over the years, from buying things in department stores to buying things in malls, and then from moving from buying things in malls to buying things online, are reflected in the personal consumption deflator. The whole idea of it is to make it a more accurate measure, but the result is that the personal consumption deflator runs about 0.5% lower than the CPI. So they've got a target of 2% in the personal consumption deflator, and it's very, very similar. You wind up with exactly the same results in the long term as having a target of the core CPI of 2.5%, which is effectively what we have in Australia. So after 1.9% core CPI this year, the Fed expects inflation to be 2% next year and the year after, and then as far as the eye can see. To achieve that, they say they've got a process of Fed rate hikes, in which there are 3 rate hikes this year, 3 rate hikes next year, and the year after that, between 3 and 4 rate hikes. What I pointed out in the piece is, hey, it's really good they've given us this scenario, but we think growth in the US economy will be faster than the Fed thinks. So instead of 2.1% growth in the Fed funds rate, in the US GDP this year, we think it'll be 2.3. Instead of 2.1 next year, we think it'll be 2.6. Now numbers are actually pretty close to the IMF numbers. The IMF thinks 2.3 this year and 2.5 next year. But that's what appears to be a small difference in growth rates generates a quite significant change in the path of the Fed funds rate. It's because of that issue about the minimum level of unemployment that I've talked about for the last couple of years. Now, if you add up the difference between our growth rate and their growth rate over the 2 years, we're estimating that the US growth rate will be 0.7% higher over the 2 years than the Fed does. And what that means is at the end of 2 years, unemployment is going to be 0.7% lower. Now, why that's really important is the lowest minimum unemployment rate over the last 30 years in the US economy is 3.9%. The Fed thinks that unemployment next year is going to be 4.5%. We think it'll be 0.7% lower than that, which means if you take 0.7 away from 4.5, you wind up with 3.8. So what that tells us is we will have collided unemployment in the US, even with that little bit of stronger growth rate, will have collided with the minimum growth rate in the US economy, by the minimum unemployment level in the US economy by the end of next year. And that means that that's the level in which we get far more rapid wages growth and far more rapid core inflation, and therefore the Fed has to react to that with higher rates. So even that little bit of stronger growth that the International Monetary Fund and we think will be there means that the Fed has to be more aggressive in its rate hikes than the Fed currently thinks. And so what we've got is a Fed rate hike every quarter in the next 2.5 years. So the Fed target in their projections of 3%, they reach it 6 months earlier than they currently think, and maybe we'll see at the time they might go a little bit further. So the US economy is stronger than the Fed thinks, but that means they have to hike rates faster.